The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the grand ballroom. 200 guests turned their heads in perfect unison, their conversations halting mid-sentence as every eye in the room locked onto me. The bride, radiant in her $1,000 gown, looked down at the sparkling mess at my feet and let out a theatrical sigh that carried across the silent room like a blade. "Well," Victoria said, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness, "I suppose we should have expected something like this. Some people just don't know how to behave at elegant events." Her perfectly manicured hand gestured dismissively in my direction as she turned to the cluster of bridesmaids surrounding her. "It's so embarrassing when people can't rise to the occasion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The word hung in the air like smoke. Embarrassing. "My son." Daniel stood frozen beside her, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The photographer continued snapping pictures, capturing what would surely become the most painful moment of what was supposed to be a celebration of love. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. I bent down slowly, my arthritic knees protesting, and began picking up the larger pieces of glass with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. A server appeared beside me with a dustpan, but the damage was already done. In one careless moment, I had become the spectacle at my own son's wedding, the mother who couldn't hold a simple glass of champagne, the woman who didn't belong in this world of crystal chandeliers and imported orchids. My name is Eleanor Catherine Walsh, and I am 67 years old. I have silver hair that refuses to stay in place no matter how much hairspray I use, hands permanently stained with soil from my garden, and a voice that has grown softer with age and disappointment. I raised my son Daniel in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival and Friday night football games at the high school. I never imagined I would find myself standing in the opulent Riverside Country Club in Chicago, surrounded by people whose jewelry cost more than my annual income. But here I was, watching my only child marry a woman who had just made it crystal clear that I was nothing more than an unwelcome reminder of his humble beginnings. The story of how we arrived at this moment begins 3 years ago, when Daniel first mentioned Victoria during one of our weekly phone calls. He had moved to Chicago after college to work at a prestigious marketing firm, and his voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard since he was a boy unwrapping Christmas presents. "Mom, I met someone," he had said, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. "Her name is Victoria Pemberton, and she's incredible. She's smart, beautiful, sophisticated. She went to Northwestern, and her family owns this amazing estate in Lake Forest. I think you're really going to love her." I remember setting down my teacup and smiling into the phone, genuinely happy to hear the joy in my son's voice. After his father left us when Daniel was only 8 years old, it had been just the two of us against the world. I had worked 2 jobs to put Daniel through college, cleaning offices at night and working as a seamstress during the day, my fingers bleeding from pinpricks and my back aching from hunching over sewing machines for hours on end. Every sacrifice had been worth it to see Daniel graduate summa cum laude and land his dream job in the city. He deserved love, happiness, and all the wonderful things life had to offer. If this Victoria could give him those things, then I was prepared to love her like the daughter I had never had. The first time I met Victoria was during Daniel's birthday weekend 6 months later. She had driven down to Cedar Falls in a sleek, black BMW that looked completely out of place parked in front of my little house with its peeling paint and crooked mailbox. I had spent days preparing, cleaning every surface until it gleamed, baking Daniel's favorite chocolate chip cookies from scratch, and even splurging on fresh flowers from the grocery store to make the house feel more welcoming. When she stepped out of that car, I was struck by how beautiful she was. tall and willowy with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or wonder if you belong somewhere. Daniel beamed as he introduced us, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "Victoria, this is my mom, Eleanor. Mom, this is Victoria." I extended my hand with a warm smile, genuinely excited to meet the woman who had captured my son's heart. Victoria's handshake was brief and limp, her perfectly manicured nails barely grazing my work-roughened palm before she pulled away. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Walsh," she said, her tone polite but distant. Her eyes swept over my modest home, taking in the secondhand furniture and family photos in drugstore frames. I caught her nose wrinkle slightly, so briefly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. The weekend was a careful dance of politeness and awkward silences. Victoria smiled at all the right moments and made appropriate comments about the food, but I could sense her discomfort in every gesture. She perched on the edge of my old sofa like she was afraid it might stain her designer jeans, and when I offered to show her Daniel's childhood bedroom with its faded baseball wallpaper and trophies from Little League, she declined with a tight smile. "That's so sweet of you to offer, but I'm actually not feeling very well." The drive was quite tiring. Daniel was oblivious to the subtle tensions, lost in the glow of new love and proud to have his two favorite women in the same room. He kept trying to include Victoria in our conversations about his childhood, sharing funny stories about the time he tried to build a rocket in our backyard or when he got suspended for defending a younger kid from bullies. Each story seemed to make Victoria withdraw further into herself, as if she was embarrassed by the normalcy of his upbringing. That night, as I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I overheard them talking in low voices on the front porch. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the kitchen window was open and their voices carried on the evening breeze. "Your mother seems lovely," Victoria was saying, though her tone suggested otherwise. "She really is," Daniel replied enthusiastically. "She's been through so much, but she never let it show. After Dad left, she worked herself to the bone to take care of me. I wouldn't be where I am today without her." There was a pause, and then Victoria's voice again, careful and measured. "It must have been difficult growing up with such limited resources. I can see why you're so driven to succeed now." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. It wasn't quite pity, but it wasn't respect either. It was the voice of someone looking down from a great height, observing lives that were foreign, and somehow lesser than her own experience. "I never felt like we were poor," Daniel said, and I could hear the slight defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Mom made sure I had everything I needed. She's amazing." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Of course," Victoria agreed quickly. "I just meant that it must motivate you to want something different for your own future. For our future." I turned off the water and stepped away from the window, my heart heavy with a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger exactly, but a deep sadness that the life I had built for my son, the sacrifices I had made, the love I had poured into raising him, could be reduced to something that needed to be overcome or left behind. The visits became less frequent after that weekend. Daniel would come home for holidays, but Victoria always had other commitments. A family gathering in the Hamptons, a charity gala in the city, a ski trip to Aspen with college friends. I told myself it didn't matter, that I understood she had her own family and obligations. But deep down, I felt the growing distance like a physical ache. When Daniel called to tell me they were engaged, his voice was electric with happiness. "She said, 'Yes, Mom. We're going to get married next spring at the Riverside Country Club. It's going to be incredible.' I congratulated him with all the enthusiasm I could muster, pushing down the small voice in my head that whispered warnings I didn't want to hear. This was my son's happiness we were talking about. If Victoria made him happy, then I would find a way to be happy for them. I can't wait to help plan the wedding, I said, already imagining the mother-son dances and family traditions we could incorporate. What kind of flowers is Victoria thinking about? I know the most wonderful florist here in town who could probably work with whatever she has in mind. There was an awkward pause on the other end of the line. Actually, Mom, Victoria's family has a wedding planner they always use. Someone who specializes in high-end events. They've got everything pretty well handled already. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Of course they would have their own wedding planner, their own vendors, their own vision that probably didn't include input from a small-town seamstress who bought flowers at the grocery store. Of course, I said, forcing brightness into my voice. I'm sure they know all the best people. Is there anything I can do to help? Maybe I could make something for the reception or help with the invitations? Another pause. Victoria's mom has some pretty specific ideas about how everything should look, but we'll definitely find something for you to contribute. The way he said it made me feel like a charity case, someone to be given busy work to keep them from interfering with. The real planning. I swallowed my hurt and focused on the joy in his voice. This wasn't about me. This was about Daniel starting his new life with the woman he loved. The months leading up to the wedding were a series of small exclusions and gentle dismissals. I wasn't invited to the engagement party, though I learned about it later when Daniel posted photos on social media. Dozens of elegantly dressed people raising champagne glasses in what appeared to be a private dining room at an exclusive restaurant. Victoria looked radiant in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, surrounded by her sorority sisters and country club friends. When I asked Daniel about it during our next phone call, he sounded genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry, Mom. It was just a small thing Victoria's parents threw together. Very last minute. Mostly her family and some work colleagues. I could see from the photos that it was anything but small or last minute. The room was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements and custom linens. A professional photographer had captured every moment. It was the kind of event that took weeks to plan and coordinate. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I told Daniel I understood and asked him to give Victoria my congratulations. The bridal shower was another event I learned about secondhand. Daniel mentioned it casually during one of our calls, describing the beautiful gifts Victoria had received and the lovely afternoon her bridesmaids had organized at some spa in the city. When I gently asked if I might have been invited, he seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Oh, Mom, I don't think that's really Victoria's family's style. They're pretty traditional about keeping things within their social circle. But I know she appreciates all the support you've given us. Traditional, social circle, the words felt like polite euphemisms for something much less kind. I was beginning to understand that in Victoria's world, I simply didn't exist. I wasn't part of the story she was telling about her perfect wedding to her successful husband. I was a chapter that had already been written and filed away, irrelevant to the new narrative they were creating together. When the wedding invitation finally arrived in my mailbox, it was everything I had expected and nothing I had hoped for. Heavy cardstock with gold embossing, formal language that sounded more like a royal decree than a celebration of love. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Pemberton request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Victoria Elizabeth to Mr. Daniel Thomas Walsh. Even on his own wedding invitation, Daniel's name seemed smaller, less important, an afterthought. To the Pemberton family legacy. There was no mention of me anywhere on the invitation. No acknowledgement that Daniel had a mother who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him. In the traditional format, it should have read, son of Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, but even that small recognition had been omitted. I was invisible, erased from my own son's wedding announcement. The dress shopping expedition was my last hope for some kind of inclusion in the wedding preparations. When Daniel called to say that Victoria had graciously offered to help me find something appropriate to wear, I felt a flutter of optimism. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch, of including me in the feminine rituals that surround a wedding. We met at an upscale boutique in downtown Chicago, the kind of place where the sales associates sized you up the moment you walked through the door. Victoria was already there when I arrived, looking effortlessly chic in a tailored blazer and designer jeans. She greeted me with the same distant politeness I had grown accustomed to, air kissing beside my cheek without actually making contact. "Eleanor, so good to see you. I thought we could find you something elegant that would photograph." "Well," the sales associate, a thin woman with severe black hair and an expression that suggested she had been interrupted from more important tasks, led us to a section of the store that might charitably be called Mother of the Bride, but felt more like attempting to camouflage middle-aged disappointment. The dresses were universally unflattering. Boxy jackets in institutional beige, shapeless shift dresses in forgettable navy, garments designed to make older women disappear into the background of their children's important moments. Victoria nodded approvingly at each successive horror, murmuring things like very age-appropriate and perfect for your coloring. When I tentatively suggested a dress in a soft lavender that actually had some shape and style, Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure that shade works with our color palette. We're going for something more neutral for the family photos." Neutral, another word that meant invisible. I ended up with a shapeless dress in mushroom gray that made me look like exactly what Victoria wanted me to be, a non-entity. Someone who could stand in the family photos without drawing attention away from the real stars of the event. As we left the boutique, Victoria linked her arm through mine in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to any observers. "I'm so glad we could do this together, Eleanor. It's important to Daniel that you feel included." Feel included. Not actually be included, but simply feel as if I was. The distinction was subtle but cutting. I was being managed, handled, given just enough attention to prevent my son from noticing how thoroughly I was being marginalized. The week before the wedding, Daniel called with excitement bubbling in his voice. "Mom, I have amazing news. Victoria's dad has offered me a promotion at his investment firm. Senior vice president, my own office. A huge salary increase. Isn't that incredible?" I should have been thrilled for him. This was everything Daniel had worked toward, the success and recognition he deserved. But something cold settled in my stomach as I listened to him describe his bright future in the Pemberton family business. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed. "You've earned it." The best part is that Victoria and I won't have to worry about money anymore. We can buy that house in Lake Forest we've been looking at, start thinking about having kids. Her dad says there's no limit to how far I can go in the company. No limit, as long as he continued to transform himself into the man Victoria's family wanted him to be. As long as he left behind the parts of himself that didn't fit their vision of success. As long as he forgot where he came from and who had helped him get there. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the photos and memories of the life Daniel and I had built together. 24 years of packed lunches and scraped knees, bedtime stories and homework help, piano recitals and baseball games. 24 years of loving him with every fiber of my being, of making his dreams my own purpose. And now, on the eve of his wedding, I finally understood that none of it mattered. I was being written out of his story, erased as cleanly as pencil, marks on paper. The woman who had raised him was no longer suitable for the man he was becoming. The morning of the wedding, I put on my gray dress and carefully applied the makeup techniques I had learned from YouTube videos. I styled my silver hair as best I could and added the small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Looking in the mirror, I saw exactly what Victoria had wanted. A forgettable woman who would blend into the background of her perfect day. But as I drove the 3 hours from Cedar Falls to Chicago, something hardened in my chest. I may have been relegated to the role of embarrassing relative, but I was still Daniel's mother. I had earned my place at his wedding through years of love and sacrifice. I would stand in those photos and smile graciously, not because Victoria had granted me permission, but because I belonged there by right. I had no idea that by the end of the night, everything would change. That a single moment of clumsiness would lead to revelations that would shake the very foundation of Daniel's new life. That the truth I had been too polite to speak would finally demand to be heard. But that part of the story was still hours away, waiting in the shadows of what promised to be the most difficult day of my life. The drive back to Cedar Falls the next morning felt like traveling between two different worlds. As I left the pristine suburbs of Lake Forest behind, the landscape gradually shifted from manicured perfection to the honest farmland of Iowa. Rolling cornfields replaced gated communities, and roadside diners took the place of exclusive country clubs. With each mile, I felt myself shrinking back into the woman I had always been, the one who didn't belong in marble ballrooms or designer dresses. My little house on Maple Street looked smaller than ever when I pulled into the driveway. The paint was peeling more noticeably now, and the flower boxes I had planted with such care seemed wilted and neglected after just 2 days away. Everything about my life suddenly felt shabby and insufficient, viewed through the lens of the opulence I had just witnessed. Inside, the silence was deafening. The wedding photos that had seemed so precious just days before now looked like relics from a different era. Daniel, at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning in his Little League uniform. Daniel at high school graduation, proud in his cap and gown while I beamed beside him in my best dress from JCPenney. Daniel moving into his college dorm, both of us crying as we said goodbye to the childhood we were leaving behind. These images documented a relationship that apparently no longer existed. The woman in these photos had believed she was essential to her son's happiness, that their bond was unbreakable, that love and sacrifice created permanent connections. She had been naive in ways I was only beginning to understand. I tried to return to my normal routine, but everything felt hollow and mechanical. I watered my garden without really seeing the plants. I sorted through my sewing projects without any enthusiasm for the work. I prepared meals for one and ate, them standing at the kitchen counter, too restless to sit at the table where Daniel and I had shared thousands of conversations over the years. The phone calls stopped almost immediately. Daniel had been calling me every Sunday evening for years, a tradition that had started during his freshman year of college when he was homesick and overwhelmed. Those calls had been the highlight of my week, 45 minutes of connection that made the distance between us feel manageable. The first Sunday after the wedding, I sat by the phone all evening, jumping every time it rang only to discover it was a telemarketer or wrong number. By 10 o'clock, I finally accepted that he wasn't calling. Maybe he was busy with honeymoon preparations or exhausted from the wedding celebrations. There would be reasonable explanations. The second Sunday was harder to rationalize away. By the third Sunday, I understood that our weekly tradition had died along with whatever remained of our relationship. The silence wasn't an oversight or a scheduling conflict. It was a choice. I began checking Daniel's social media obsessively, scrolling through photos from his honeymoon in Tuscany and later, images of their new house in Lake Forest. Victoria documented their perfect life with the skill of a professional curator. Artfully arranged breakfast tables on their marble kitchen island. Designer furniture positioned just so in rooms with soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows. Garden parties with beautiful people holding champagne flutes and laughing at jokes I would never understand. Daniel appeared in these photos as a supporting character in Victoria's narrative. He was always impeccably dressed, always smiling, always surrounded by the kind of people he had never known before her. In one particularly painful image, he was playing tennis at what appeared to be a private club, wearing whites that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The caption read, "My husband fitting right in with the Lake Forest crowd." Fitting right in. The phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. This was what Victoria had wanted all along, for Daniel to fit seamlessly into her world as if he had always belonged there. The rough edges of his upbringing had been polished away, the evidence of his modest beginnings carefully erased. I found myself driving past the high school where Daniel had played baseball, remembering the countless games I had attended, cheering from the bleachers in whatever weather Iowa threw at us. The coach had said Daniel had natural talent but lacked the confidence that came from professional training. We couldn't afford private lessons or elite summer camps, so he made do with community league teams and hand-me-down equipment. He had been happy then, genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or exclusive clubs. He loved the game for its own sake, not because it connected him to the right sort of people. When had that changed? When had authentic joy been replaced by the performed happiness I saw in Victoria's carefully curated photos? The isolation was suffocating. Cedar Falls had always been a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But now, I felt like a ghost drifting through familiar places. At the grocery store, former neighbors would ask politely about Daniel's wedding, their voices bright with the kind of forced enthusiasm reserved for topics that made people uncomfortable. I saw the photos on Facebook, Mrs. Henderson from the next street over said while we waited in the checkout line. "Such a fancy affair. You must be so proud." I smiled and nodded, offering the appropriate responses, while inside I felt like I was lying about my own life. Yes, it was beautiful. Yes, Victoria looked lovely. Yes, we're all very happy. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Even worse were the women who had known me for decades, who remembered the struggles of raising Daniel alone and had witnessed firsthand the sacrifices I had made. Their sympathy was well-intentioned, but devastating in its accuracy. "I'm sure it's hard, having him so far away now," said Linda Morrison, who had been my neighbor when Daniel was small. "Different when they get married, isn't it? Especially to someone from such a different background." Different background. Everyone could see what I had been trying not to acknowledge. Daniel hadn't just married Victoria. He had married into a world that had no place for women like me. Linda understood this because she had raised her own children on teacher's salary and hand-me-down clothes. She recognized the particular pain of watching your child ascend to heights that left you behind. The worst part was the mail. Wedding thank you notes began arriving from other guests, standard etiquette for such formal affairs. I opened each, one hoping for some small acknowledgement of my presence, some indication that I had mattered to the celebration in even the smallest way. Instead, I found generic cards with pre-printed messages and Victoria's perfect cursive signature. "Thank you for celebrating our special day with us. Your presence made our wedding complete." The irony was crushing. My presence had been tolerated, not celebrated, and had made their wedding complete only in the sense that my exclusion would have been too obvious to ignore. Daniel's name appeared on the cards too, but I recognized Victoria's handwriting throughout. He hadn't even participated in thanking the guests at his own wedding. Every aspect of their social obligations was being managed by his new wife, further evidence of how completely she was taking control of his life. I started attending the early service at First Methodist, the one that attracted mostly elderly congregants and young families with small children. The later service drew the more prominent members of the community, people who might ask uncomfortable questions about Daniel's wedding or offer sympathy I wasn't ready to accept. Sitting in the back pew, listening to hymns I had sung since childhood, I tried to find comfort in familiar rituals, but even here, surrounded by the faith that had sustained me through divorce and financial struggles and single motherhood, I felt adrift. The God I had always believed in was supposed to reward love and sacrifice, to honor the bonds between parents and children. Yet here I was, more alone than I had ever been, despite decades of putting Daniel's needs before my own. Pastor Williams approached me after service one Sunday, his kind face creased with concern. He was a gentle man in his 60s who had known our family since Daniel was in middle school. Eleanor, I've been thinking about you since I heard about Daniel's wedding. How are you adjusting to this new chapter? The carefully neutral way he phrased the question told me everything. Even our pastor understood that this wasn't a simple case of empty nest syndrome. This was something more fundamental, a severing of connections that went beyond normal developmental changes. I'm managing, I said, because what else could I say? That I felt like I was grieving someone who was still alive? That I lay awake at night wondering what I had done wrong? That I was beginning to question whether everything I had believed about maternal love was naive foolishness? Marriage changes families, Pastor Williams said gently. Sometimes those changes are harder than we expect. Remember that love doesn't disappear just because circumstances shift. I wanted to believe him, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Love might not disappear, but it could certainly be redirected, diminished, and ultimately rendered irrelevant by more powerful forces like ambition and social pressure. The autumn months passed in a haze of routine and disappointment. I threw myself into my sewing work, taking on more alterations than I could comfortably handle just to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. The repetitive motions of hemming and mending provided a kind of meditation, requiring just enough concentration to prevent my thoughts from spiraling into darker territory. My small sewing room became a refuge filled with the familiar sounds of my ancient singer machine and the soft rustle of fabric. Women from town brought me their projects, and I lost myself in the satisfaction of making things fit properly, of fixing what was broken, of taking something ordinary and making it special. But even this sanctuary was invaded by reminders of my changed circumstances. Mrs. Patterson brought me a bridesmaid dress that needed significant alterations for her daughter's wedding, and as I worked on the delicate beadwork, I couldn't help remembering Victoria's elaborate gown and the small army of seamstresses who had undoubtedly worked on it. "My daughter's so excited," Mrs. Patterson chattered while I pinned the hem. "It's not going to be a huge affair like some weddings these days, but we're doing our best to make it special. You know how important these moments are for mothers." Mothers. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had been excluded from the most important moment in my son's life, relegated to the role of embarrassing relative who had to be managed rather than celebrated. The traditional mother-son moments that should have been mine had been stolen by Victoria's need for perfection and control. I finished the dress in silence, my vision blurred by tears I refused to let fall. When Mrs. Patterson left, clutching the altered dress and bubbling with excitement about her daughter's upcoming celebration, I sat alone in my sewing room and finally admitted the truth I had been avoiding for months. I was never going to get my son back. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, doubling me over with grief so intense it felt like my chest was caving in. All my hopes for reconciliation, all my rationalizations about temporary adjustments and new marriage dynamics, all my faith that love would eventually triumph over social pressure crumbled in that moment. Daniel was gone. Not dead, but lost to me just as surely as if he had vanished from the earth. The boy I had raised, the young man I had sacrificed everything for, the person who had been my whole world for 24 years no longer existed. In his place was a stranger who wore expensive clothes and attended charity galas and pretended to have always belonged in a world that required my erasure for his acceptance. The tears came then, great heaving sobs that I couldn't control or contain. I cried for the mother-son relationship that had been my greatest joy and proudest achievement. I cried for the grandchildren I would never really know, who would grow up thinking of me as some distant figure from their father's past. I cried for the naive woman I had been, who believed that love was enough, that sacrifice created permanent bonds, that being a good mother guaranteed a place in your child's life. Most of all, I cried for the crushing understanding that everything I had built my identity around was gone. For 24 years, I had been Daniel's mother first, and everything else second. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of what was best for him. Every sacrifice was justified by his happiness and success. Every penny saved, every opportunity foregone, every relationship neglected was acceptable because I was investing in his future. Now, sitting alone in my cluttered sewing room, surrounded by the modest life I had built around his needs, I realized I had no idea who I was supposed to be without him. The woman who existed independently of her role as Daniel's mother was a stranger I had never bothered to meet. The phone rang, jarring me out of my spiral of self-pity. For a wild moment, my heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be Daniel, finally calling to bridge the silence that had grown between us. Instead, it was my sister Patricia calling from Phoenix. Patricia was 10 years older than me, and had always been the practical one in our family. She had married her college sweetheart, raised 3 successful children, and navigated life with the kind of steady competence I had always envied. Her kids called her regularly, visited for holidays, and included her in their major life decisions. She had done everything right, while I had apparently done everything wrong. "I've been thinking about you since the wedding," she said without preamble. Patricia had never been one for social niceties. "How are you holding up?" The genuine concern in her voice broke down what remained of my composure. Through tears and hiccuping sobs, I told her everything. The systematic exclusion from wedding planning, the overheard conversation about phasing me out, the broken champagne glass and Victoria's cruel comments, the silence that had followed. I confessed my fears about never seeing future grandchildren, my confusion about what I had done wrong, my terror of spending the rest of my life alone. Patricia listened without interrupting, letting me purge months of accumulated pain and disappointment. When I finally ran out of words, she was quiet, for a long moment before speaking. "Eleanor, honey, this isn't about what you did wrong. You raised a good boy who became a successful man. Sometimes success comes with a price, and sometimes that price gets paid by the people who made the success possible." Her words offered a perspective I hadn't considered. Maybe this wasn't a failure on my part, but a consequence of Daniel's transition into a world that valued appearance over authenticity, connections over character. Maybe I wasn't being rejected for my inadequacies, but for my inconvenient authenticity. But what am I supposed to do now? I asked, my voice small and lost. How do I build a life when everything I cared about is gone? "You start by remembering that you had a life before Daniel, and you can have one after him too," Patricia said firmly. "You're 67 years old, not 97. You have years ahead of you that could be filled with things that matter to you, not just things that matter to someone else." The conversation with Patricia planted a seed that would take months to grow, but it marked the beginning of a slow shift in my thinking. Maybe the question wasn't how to get Daniel back, but how to build something meaningful from what remained of my life. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Cedar Falls in snow that made everything look clean and new. I spent long evenings by my fireplace, reading books I had put aside for years while focusing on Daniel's needs. I rediscovered authors I had loved in college, lost myself in stories that had nothing to do with my own complicated reality. Slowly, very slowly, I began to remember pieces of the woman I had been before motherhood consumed my identity. I had been an English major with dreams of teaching or maybe writing. I had loved art museums and foreign films and long conversations about books and ideas. I had been curious about the world beyond Cedar Falls, interested in travel and culture and experiences that had nothing to do with Little League schedules or parent-teacher conferences. That woman felt like someone I had known in another lifetime, but traces of her remained buried under decades of maternal devotion. As the snow fell and the year wound toward its close, I began to wonder if it might be possible to excavate those buried parts of myself and build something new from what I found. The holidays passed without a word from Daniel. No Christmas card, no phone call, no acknowledgement of the traditions we had shared for decades. I spent Christmas Day alone for the first time in my adult life, eating a small turkey dinner and watching old movies while snow fell outside my windows. It should have been the loneliest day of my life, and in many ways it was. But there was also something strangely liberating about not having to perform holiday cheer or pretend that everything was fine. I could acknowledge my sadness without trying to protect anyone else from it. As the new year approached, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I was going to stop waiting for Daniel to remember that he had a mother who loved him. I was going to stop checking my phone for calls that never came and my mailbox for letters that would never arrive. I was going to stop organizing my emotional life around the hope that he would eventually choose me over the world that required my absence for his acceptance. Instead, I was going to try to remember who Eleanor Walsh had been before she became Daniel's mother, and who she might become if she stopped defining herself by relationships that no longer existed. It was a terrifying prospect, like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. But staying where I was, suspended in hope and disappointment, felt like a different kind of death. At least falling meant moving forward. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks lit up the sky over Cedar Falls and neighbors celebrated with champagne and resolutions, I sat in my quiet house and made a promise to myself. I would spend the coming year learning to love the life I actually had, instead of mourning the life I thought I was supposed to have. I had no idea how to begin, but I was finally ready to try. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were still mornings when I woke up reaching for my phone to check for messages that hadn't come. Still evenings when I caught myself setting 2 places at the dinner table out of habit. The muscle memory of motherhood died hard, and grief had its own timeline that couldn't be rushed or rationalized away. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been dormant for decades. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for when Daniel's needs took priority. My first attempts were clumsy and frustrating, but there was something deeply satisfying about creating something purely for my own pleasure. I joined a book club at the library, diving into contemporary fiction and memoir with women who had their own stories of loss and reinvention. We met twice a month in the library's community room, drinking coffee from paper cups and debating plot points and character motivations with the intensity of graduate students. These women became my first new friends in years, relationships that had nothing to do with my role as someone's mother. Most surprisingly, I began to travel. Small trips at first, weekend excursions to nearby cities to visit museums or attend concerts. I had never traveled alone before, and the first solo hotel stay felt impossibly lonely and strange. But gradually, I discovered the unexpected pleasure of setting my own schedule, of lingering in front of paintings that spoke to me without worrying about someone else's impatience. I took a week-long trip to Santa Fe, staying in a small bed and breakfast and spending my days exploring art galleries and hiking trails in the high desert. The landscape was unlike anything I had ever experienced, vast and austere and beautiful, in ways that had nothing to do with the manicured prettiness of Victoria's perfect world. Sitting on a ridge overlooking the city as the sun set behind distant mountains, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the absence of sadness, but the presence of something larger than my personal disappointments. The world was enormous and complex and full of beauty that existed independent of my relationship with my son. This didn't mean I stopped missing Daniel, or hoping that he might someday remember the woman who had raised him. The love I felt for him was too deep to simply disappear, and probably always would be. But that love no longer defined the boundaries of my existence. I was learning to be someone other than Daniel's mother, and to my surprise, that someone was worth knowing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, nearly a year after the wedding. I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately, though it looked different somehow, more formal and controlled than the scrawled notes he used to leave me as a teenager. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure whether I wanted to read what he had written. The letter was brief and devastating in its carefully chosen words, He was writing to let me know that Victoria was pregnant. They were expecting their first child in September. He thought I should know, though he wasn't sure what role I would play in the baby's life given the geographical distance and different lifestyles. Different lifestyles, another euphemism for the unbridgeable gap between his new world and my old one. He closed by saying he hoped I was well, and that maybe we could figure out some kind of arrangement for occasional visits once the baby was older. Some kind of arrangement. As if my relationship with my grandchild was a business deal to be negotiated, rather than a bond to be celebrated. As if I was a potentially disruptive influence who needed to be managed and contained, rather than a grandmother who had love to offer. I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, unsure whether to laugh or cry at the casual cruelty of its tone. This was how Daniel saw me now. A logistical problem to be solved, a remnant from his past that required careful handling to avoid contaminating his perfect present. But something had changed in me during the long months of learning to live without him. The woman who would have been devastated by this letter, who would have spent weeks analyzing every word for hidden hope or meaning, was no longer the woman I was becoming. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This letter had finally made explicit what I had been trying not to see for over a year. Daniel had made his choice, and it wasn't me. Victoria's family had succeeded in their goal of erasing me from his life, and he had been a willing participant in his own transformation. I could spend the rest of my life grieving what I had lost, or I could choose to celebrate what I had found in the process of letting go. For the first time in decades, my life belonged entirely to me. No one else's needs or expectations or definitions of success could touch the peace I was slowly building in the spaces Daniel had left behind. That evening, I wrote him back. My letter was even briefer than his, but infinitely more honest. Dear Daniel, congratulations on your pregnancy. I hope you and Victoria will be very happy. I won't be making any arrangements for visits. A grandchild deserves grandparents who are wanted and welcomed, not tolerated as an inconvenience. I love you and always will, but I'm done accepting scraps of affection from people who see my love as an embarrassment. I hope someday you remember who you used to be and who helped you become the man you are. Until then, I wish you all the happiness your new life can provide. Love, Mom. I mailed it the next morning without reading it again, knowing that second-guessing would only weaken my resolve. It was the last letter I would ever write to my son, and it felt like both an ending and a beginning. The months that followed were the quietest of my adult life, but they were also the richest. I was learning the difference between loneliness and solitude, between missing someone and missing the idea of them. I was discovering who Eleanor Walsh was when she wasn't trying to be anyone else's version of the perfect mother. And slowly, surprisingly, I was finding that person worth knowing. 3 years had passed since that devastating wedding day, and I barely recognized the woman I had become. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but rather a slow excavation of someone who had been buried beneath decades of self-sacrifice and maternal devotion. At 70, I had silver hair that I wore long and loose instead of in the practical bun I had maintained for years. My hands, once soft from sewing and cooking, were now strong and weathered from the pottery wheel I had discovered at the community center. My little house on Maple Street had undergone its own metamorphosis. Gone were the shrine-like displays of Daniel's childhood achievements, replaced by artwork I had created myself and photographs from my travels. The walls now held watercolors of New Mexican sunsets and black and white prints from my photography class. Books filled every surface, stacked in precarious towers that spoke of a mind hungry for new ideas after years of intellectual starvation. I had become someone I never imagined I could be. A woman content with her own company, excited by her own projects, fulfilled by friendships that had nothing to do with shared children or old obligations. The book club had expanded into dinner parties where we debated everything from politics to poetry. My art classes had led to small exhibitions at local coffee shops and the library. I had even started writing, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as I discovered I had stories to tell that weren't about other people's lives. The loneliness that had nearly destroyed me in those first months after Daniel's wedding had been replaced by something I hadn't experienced since I was young. Genuine solitude that felt like a gift rather than a punishment. I could spend entire Sundays reading without checking my phone, travel to new cities without reporting my whereabouts to anyone, make decisions based solely on what interested me rather than what someone else needed. It was during this period of renaissance that I received the phone call that would shatter my carefully constructed peace. The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but warm. "Mrs. Walsh? This is Dr. Jennifer Morrison from Chicago Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Daniel Walsh." My blood turned to ice. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the years of silence and rejection, the maternal instinct never truly dies. "Is he hurt? What happened?" "Mr. Walsh is stable now, but he was in a serious car accident 3 days ago. He sustained a traumatic brain injury and has been in a medically induced coma while we waited for the swelling to reduce. He's conscious now, but he's experiencing some memory issues." Memory issues. The words felt surreal, loaded with implications I couldn't yet process. What kind of memory issues? Dr. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. "He remembers his childhood clearly, but seems to have significant gaps in his recent memory. The last few years are unclear to him. We expect most of his memory to return as he heals, but right now he's been asking for you repeatedly. Mrs. Walsh, he doesn't seem to remember being married." The world tilted sideways. Daniel, lying in a hospital bed, his mind somehow reset to a time before Victoria had transformed him into someone I didn't recognize. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical pain. After 3 years of learning to live without him, fate had handed me back the son I thought I had lost forever. But it was more complicated than that, of course. Dr. Morrison explained that Victoria was devastated that she had been at his bedside constantly, trying to help him remember their life together. Their 2-year-old daughter, Emma, was too young to understand why Daddy didn't recognize her. The entire carefully constructed world they had built together was crumbling because Daniel's injured brain couldn't access the memories that made it real. "Would you be able to come to Chicago?" Dr. Morrison asked gently. His agitation has been concerning, and familiar faces from his clearer memories might help with his recovery. I should have felt vindicated. Victoria, who had worked so systematically to erase me from Daniel's life, now needed me to help restore what had been lost. The woman who had called me embarrassing and orchestrated my exclusion was now forced to watch her husband cry out for a mother he couldn't remember rejecting. Instead, I felt something much more complex: grief for the young woman whose perfect life had been shattered by random chance, and terror at the prospect of opening myself up to Daniel's love again, knowing it might disappear as quickly as his memories returned. "I'll drive up tomorrow," I heard myself saying, though I wasn't sure it was the right decision. The drive to Chicago felt like traveling backward through time. With each mile, I found myself remembering the young mother I had been, the woman who would have moved mountains to ease her son's pain. By the time I reached the hospital, my hands were shaking and my carefully constructed emotional defenses were crumbling. The ICU was a maze of machines and monitors, soft beeping sounds, and the hushed conversations of medical staff. Victoria sat in the hallway outside Daniel's room, looking nothing like the polished woman who had orchestrated my humiliation 3 years earlier. Her blonde hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore yesterday's clothes, and no makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow with exhaustion. When she saw me walking down the hall, her face crumpled completely. "Eleanor, thank God you came." The use of my first name, spoken with genuine gratitude instead of barely concealed disdain, was so jarring that I almost stopped walking. This was not the Victoria who had called me embarrassing at her wedding reception, who had systematically excluded me from every meaningful moment of their relationship. This was a frightened young mother watching her world collapse around her. "He doesn't remember me," she said, her voice breaking. "He looks at me like I'm a stranger. When I try to show him pictures of our wedding, of Emma, he gets agitated and keeps asking why I'm lying to him. He says he would never marry someone like me." Someone like me. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with all the class, distinctions and social barriers that had once seemed so important to Victoria's family. In his injured state, Daniel's mind had apparently reverted to a version of himself that recognized those barriers as obstacles rather than aspirations. "The doctors say familiar faces and voices might help trigger his memory," Victoria continued. "He's been asking for you constantly. He wants to know why you haven't visited him." The knife twisted deeper. Even in his confused state, Daniel expected his mother to be there when he needed her. He couldn't understand why the woman who had never missed a day when he was sick as a child would be absent during the most frightening experience of his adult life. "Can I see him?" I asked quietly. Victoria nodded and led me to the door of his room. Through the window, I could see Daniel lying in the hospital bed, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. Machines monitored his vital signs, and a bandage covered much of his head, but his eyes were open and alert. "Daniel?" Victoria said softly as we entered. "Your mom is here." He turned toward me, and the smile that spread across his face was the same one I remembered from his childhood, unguarded and full of love. "Mom, finally. I was starting to think something had happened to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. In his mind, I was still the center of his world, the person he turned to in crisis, the woman whose absence would be unthinkable during his time of need. He had no memory of the years of silence, no recollection of choosing Victoria's world over mine, no awareness of how completely he had written me out of his life. "I'm here now," I managed, moving to his bedside and taking his hand. His fingers closed around mine with desperate strength. "This lady keeps saying she's my wife," he said, gesturing toward Victoria with confusion. "But Mom, you know I would never marry someone like her. She's not like us. She doesn't understand anything about real life." Victoria flinched as if she had been slapped. These were probably echoes of things Daniel had said years ago when they first started dating. Observations about class differences that he had learned to suppress as he adapted to her world. Now, with his social filters damaged, his unvarnished, thoughts were spilling out with devastating honesty. "She has a little girl who she says is mine," Daniel continued, his voice growing more agitated. "But I would remember having a child, wouldn't I? I would remember getting married. This doesn't make sense." I looked across the bed at Victoria, who was struggling not to cry. Her perfect life had been built on Daniel's willingness to transform himself, to suppress the parts of his identity that didn't fit her family's vision. Now that transformation had been erased, leaving her face to face with the man he had been before he learned to want what she offered. "The doctors say your memory will come back," I said gently, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "You were in an accident. Your brain needs time to heal." "But you'll stay, won't you?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the same note of anxiety it had held when he was 8 years old and afraid his father might leave again. "You won't go back to Iowa while I'm like this?" I found myself nodding before I could think through the implications. "I'll stay as long as you need me." Victoria excused herself shortly after, claiming she needed to check on Emma, but I suspected she couldn't bear to watch Daniel's obvious preference for my company over hers. For 3 years, she had been the center of his world, the woman whose needs and desires shaped every decision he made. Now she was relegated to the role of confused stranger, while his mother reclaimed her place as his primary emotional connection. Over the following days, I found myself living in a strange parallel universe where Daniel loved me unconditionally again, He wanted me to stay in his room constantly, grew anxious when I left for meals or to shower at the hotel Victoria had arranged for me. He peppered me with questions about his life, trying to piece together the years that remained frustratingly blank. The gaps in his memory were specific and telling. He remembered his childhood clearly, could recite the names of his Little League teammates, and recall conversations we had held over dinner when he was in high school. He remembered college in vivid detail, including his struggles with homesickness and our weekly phone calls. But everything after graduation was hazy at best, full of confusing fragments that didn't fit together into a coherent narrative. "I remember meeting this girl at work," he said during one of our long conversations while afternoon light filtered through his hospital window. "Victoria something. She was beautiful but seemed kind of cold. I remember thinking she looked at me like I was some kind of project." The observation was so accurate and so damning that I had to look away. Daniel's younger self had seen exactly what Victoria was doing, but somewhere along the way, he had allowed himself to be convinced that her project was worth submitting to. "I remember her parents," he continued, his forehead creasing with effort. "They had this huge house and acted like I should be grateful they were talking to me. The father offered me some kind of job, but I thought it was weird. Why would you want to work for your girlfriend's dad?" That was the detail that broke my heart completely. In his original state, Daniel had recognized the trap that Harrison Pemberton's job offer represented. He had understood instinctively that accepting would compromise his independence and tie him to a family that saw him as a charity case rather than an equal. But somehow, Victoria and her parents had worn down his resistance until accepting seemed like the smart, mature choice. Victoria visited every day, often bringing Emma in the hope that seeing his daughter might trigger some recognition. The little girl was beautiful, with Daniel's dark hair and eyes, but Victoria's delicate features. She was shy around this stranger who was supposedly her father, clinging to her mother and watching Daniel with the wariness of a child who sensed something was wrong. These visits were painful for everyone involved. Daniel tried to be kind to the little girl, but his interactions with her were stilted and artificial. He had no emotional connection to this child who shared his DNA but none of his memories. Victoria watched these failed encounters with increasing desperation, as if she could will him to remember through sheer force of need. The most devastating. Moments came when Victoria would try to share memories of their life together, showing him photos from their wedding or their honeymoon, describing holidays they had celebrated or friends they had made together. Daniel would study these images with the detached interest of someone looking at pictures of strangers. "This doesn't feel like my life," he said after one particularly difficult session where Victoria had brought a wedding album. "I mean, I can see that it's me in the pictures, but it's like watching someone else's movie." "But it is your life," Victoria insisted, her voice tight with desperation. "We've been married for over 3 years. We have a home together, friends, a whole life we've built." Daniel shook his head slowly. "The man in these pictures isn't me. Look at him." He pointed to a photo of himself in a tuxedo, standing with Victoria's family at some formal event. "He's wearing a costume, pretending to be someone he's not. I would never choose to be around people like that." People like that. The casual dismissal hit Victoria like a physical blow, and I watched her carefully construct mask finally crack completely. She excused herself quickly, but not before I saw tears streaming down her face. Later that evening, when Daniel was sleeping and the hospital had grown quiet, Victoria found me in the family waiting area. She looked exhausted and defeated, aged, by the stress of watching her perfect life disintegrate in real time. "I need to ask you something," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "And I need you to be honest." I nodded, unsure what was coming. "Did Daniel ever love me?" "The real Daniel. I mean, not the version of himself he became after we got married." The question hung between us like a challenge. This was my chance for revenge, my opportunity to tell Victoria exactly what I thought of her systematic campaign, to erase me from my son's life. I could have described the conversations Daniel and I used to have about feeling pressured to change, about his discomfort with her family's expectations, about his growing distance from his own values and identity. Instead, I found myself thinking about the young woman sitting beside me, whose world was collapsing just as completely as mine had 3 years earlier. Victoria was experiencing her own version of losing Daniel, watching the man she had married disappear just as I had watched my son transform into someone I didn't recognize. "I think he loved the idea of you," I said finally. "The life you represented, the possibilities you offered. But I'm not sure he ever loved you for who you actually were, just like I'm not sure you ever loved him for who he actually was." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the truth we had both been avoiding. "His parents offered him that promotion right after we got engaged," she said quietly. "I thought it was wonderful, that it would give us the financial security to build the life I wanted. But now I wonder if it was just another way to control him." The admission surprised me. Victoria had always presented their life as a fairy tale, a perfect love story between two people who were meant to be together. But apparently, even she had recognized the coercive elements that had shaped their relationship. "Maybe the accident is a gift," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is his chance to choose differently, to become the person he was meant to be instead of the person we all pressured him to become." The wisdom in her words was unexpected and devastating. Victoria was essentially suggesting that losing the Daniel she had married might be worth it if it meant he could find his authentic self again. It was the kind of selfless love I hadn't thought her capable of. "What about Emma?" I asked gently. "What about your life together?" Victoria's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "Emma deserves a father who chose to be her father, not someone who was manipulated into a life he never really wanted. And I deserve to be loved for who I am, not resented for what I represent." Over the following weeks, as Daniel's physical health improved but his memories remained stubbornly absent, Victoria began making arrangements to rebuild her life. She moved back in with her parents temporarily, giving Daniel space to figure out who he wanted to be without the pressure of maintaining relationships he couldn't remember choosing. The decision was presented as temporary, a practical arrangement while Daniel recovered, but we all understood it was really the beginning of the end of their marriage. Victoria was choosing to release him rather than fight for a relationship built on versions of themselves that no longer existed. Daniel's reaction to this news was complex. Part of him seemed relieved to be free of obligations he couldn't understand, but part of him felt guilty about the pain his condition was causing an innocent woman and child. The guilt was especially sharp regarding Emma, whom he recognized deserved better than a father who felt like a stranger to her. "I keep thinking I should remember loving her," he confided to me one afternoon as we watched Emma play in the hospital garden through his window. "She's my daughter, but when I look at her, I feel nothing. Not love, not connection, just responsibility." It was a brutal honesty that cut through all the social expectations and emotional manipulation that had shaped the last few years of his life. Daniel was learning the difference between chosen love and imposed duty, between authentic connection and performed relationship. As his release date approached, Daniel faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could try to rebuild his marriage to Victoria, attempt to reconnect with the daughter he couldn't remember loving, and return to the successful career that had been arranged for him by his father-in-law. Or he could start over, building a life based on who he actually was, rather than who others needed him to be. The night before he was scheduled to leave the hospital, Daniel asked me to help him make the decision that had been weighing on him for weeks. "I don't know what to do, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the same uncertainty it had held when he was a teenager facing his first major life choice. Everyone keeps telling me I should try to get my memory back, that I should fight for my old life. But what if my old life was wrong? What if losing those memories was the best thing that ever happened to me? I looked at my son, seeing glimpses of the boy I had raised alongside the man he had become and the person he might still choose to be. The decision wasn't really mine to make, but for the first time in years, I felt like my opinion mattered to him again. "I think," I said carefully, "that you should choose the life that feels true to who you are now, not who you were pressured to become. Your memories might come back, or they might not. But either way, you get to decide what kind of man you want to be going forward." Daniel nodded slowly, and I could see him weighing the implications of choosing authenticity over expectation, love over obligation, his own values over other people's definitions of success. The choice he made would reshape not just his future, but mine as well. Because for the first time in 3 years, I was about to discover whether the son I had lost was truly gone forever, or if he had just been waiting for permission to come home. That night, as I sat in my hotel room preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring, I realized that Daniel's accident had given both of us something we thought was lost forever, a second chance to choose each other. Not out of duty or guilt or social expectation, but out of genuine love and mutual respect. Whether we would take that chance remained to be seen, but for the first time since his wedding day, I had hope that the story between us wasn't over yet. Daniel's discharge from the hospital came on a crisp October morning when the leaves outside his window had turned the colors of flame. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. 3 weeks of medical evaluations and cognitive tests of Victoria's eye, tearful visits, and Emma's confused stares, of conversations between Daniel and me that felt like stepping back in time to when we actually knew each other. Dr. Morrison had been cautiously optimistic about his physical recovery, but remained uncertain about his memories. "Some patients regain everything within months," she explained, as we sat in her office reviewing Daniel's discharge papers. "Others never recover certain periods of their lives. The brain is remarkably resilient, but it's also unpredictable. What matters most now is that Daniel feels supported as he decides how to move forward." Victoria had spent the previous evening with Daniel, having what they both described as the most honest conversation of their relationship. She had finally stopped trying to convince him to remember their life together and instead asked him what he wanted for his future. The result was a mutual decision that felt like both an ending and a beginning. They would divorce, quietly and amicably, with Victoria retaining primary custody of Emma. Daniel would have visitation rights, but they all understood that his relationship with his daughter would need to be built from scratch, if it could be built at all. Victoria's parents had been devastated by the decision, not because they loved Daniel, but because they had invested so much in transforming him into their ideal son-in-law. Harrison had already begun making calls to replace Daniel at the investment firm, his disappointment palpable but unsurprising. The house in Lake Forest would be sold, with Victoria using her share to buy something smaller but still respectable in Evanston. Daniel, meanwhile, had shocked everyone by announcing his intention to return to Iowa with me, at least temporarily, while he figured out what kind of life he wanted to build from the fragments of who he used to be. "I need to remember who I was before I became someone else," he had told Victoria during their final conversation as husband and wife. "Maybe being back where I grew up will help me understand how I lost myself in the first place." Victoria had accepted this decision with more grace than I expected, though I suspected her calm exterior hid a deep well of grief for the future she had planned so carefully. She was only 35 years old, beautiful and accomplished, with enough family money to ensure she and Emma would never want for anything material. But she would be starting over emotionally, learning to build relationships based on authenticity rather than manipulation. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt like a pilgrimage in reverse. Daniel sat in the passenger seat of my Honda, staring, out at the landscape with the fascination of someone seeing familiar territory through new eyes. He remembered these roads from childhood trips to visit his grandmother, but the context was different now. Then, he had been a boy excited about adventure and homemade cookies. Now, he was a 32-year-old man fleeing from a life that had never really fit him. "It looks smaller than I remembered," he said as we passed through the outskirts of town, noting the new shopping centers and chain restaurants that had sprouted up during his absence. "Everything looks smaller when you come back as an adult," I replied. "But sometimes smaller can feel like home in ways that bigger never could." The house on Maple Street had been my refuge for 3 years, the place where I had learned to live alone and discovered who I was beyond my role as Daniel's mother. Now, suddenly, it was being transformed back into a family home, though the family it housed was different from the one that had originally lived there. Daniel moved slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces and examining photographs with the careful attention of an archaeologist studying artifacts from a lost civilization. The pictures of his childhood were triggers for vivid memories, but the few photos from his adult years before the accident felt like looking at documentation of someone else's life. "I can't believe I let you take down all my baseball trophies," he said, standing in what had been his bedroom and was now my art studio. The walls were covered with my watercolors and photographs from my travels, evidence of the life I had built in his absence. "You didn't let me do anything," I said gently. "You weren't here to have an opinion about what I did with the space." The truth of that statement hung between us, a reminder of the years of silence that his memory loss had temporarily erased. Daniel studied my artwork with genuine interest, seeing his mother as an artist for perhaps the first time in his life. "These are really good, Mom," he said, examining a series of desert landscapes I had painted during my trip to Santa Fe. "I never knew you were talented like this." "You never asked," I replied, then immediately regretted the sharpness in my voice. But Daniel didn't flinch from the criticism. "I was a selfish son, wasn't I?" he asked quietly. "Even before the accident, before I forgot everything. I took you for granted." The question was so direct, so lacking in the careful diplomacy that had characterized our relationship in recent years, that I found myself answering with equal honesty. "You weren't selfish, you were ambitious, and you got caught up in a world that required you to leave certain parts of yourself behind, including me." Daniel nodded slowly, processing this information with the same methodical approach he had once applied to his studies. "Victoria's family never liked me, did they?" "Not really. They liked the idea of me, but only after I became someone different." "I think they saw you as a project," I said carefully. "Someone who could be improved and molded into their image of success. And I think you let them because you wanted what they offered. But it wasn't real," Daniel said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he was discovering something profound. "None of it was real. The job, the house, the friends, even the marriage. It was all performance." We spent the afternoon setting up the guest room for him. A space that had been purely decorative for years suddenly needed to function as a bedroom again. As we made the bed with sheets that still smelled like the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closet, Daniel asked, the question I had been dreading, "Will you tell me about the wedding? About what happened between us?" I had hoped his memories might return gradually, sparing both of us the pain of revisiting that awful day. But Daniel's direct approach to rebuilding his understanding of his life meant confronting even the most difficult truths. So I told him everything. About the systematic exclusion from wedding planning, about the champagne glass and Victoria's cruel comments, about the conversation I had overheard revealing their family's plan to phase me out of his life. I described the years of silence that followed, the gradual acceptance that I had lost him to a world that required my absence for his acceptance. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face growing more troubled with each revelation. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, staring at his hands. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I'm sorry I let them turn me into someone who could hurt you like that. I'm sorry I chose their approval over your love." The apology was more than I had ever expected to receive, but it also raised complicated questions about responsibility and identity. Was this the same Daniel who had rejected me, or was his memory loss so complete that he was essentially a different person? Could someone apologize for actions they couldn't remember taking? "You don't need to apologize for things you can't remember," I said gently. "But I do remember the person I used to be," Daniel replied. "The boy you raised, the values you taught me. That person would never have treated you the way I apparently did. So either I forgot who I was long before the accident, or I chose to become someone I shouldn't have been." The insight was remarkable in its clarity. Daniel was recognizing that his transformation hadn't begun with the brain injury, but had been a gradual process of abandoning his authentic self in pursuit of external validation. The accident had simply stripped away the layers of artificial identity to reveal what remained underneath. The first weeks of Daniel's return to Cedar Falls were a delicate dance of rediscovery. He applied for a position at the local high school teaching business and economics, subjects he had mastered during his brief corporate career, but could now approach from a perspective grounded in community rather than profit. The salary was a fraction of what he had earned at Harrison's investment firm, but it came with something his previous job had lacked, a sense of purpose that aligned with his values. He rented a small apartment downtown, insisting on maintaining his independence, even as we rebuilt our relationship. "I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own," he explained. "Not leaning on you, not propped up by Victoria's family, just me figuring out who I am and what I want." The teaching position suited him perfectly. His students responded to his genuine interest in their lives and futures, and his colleagues appreciated his lack of pretension. He coached the debate team and volunteered for the financial literacy program, finding satisfaction in work that contributed to his community rather than simply generating wealth for already wealthy people. Slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation. Daniel would come for dinner twice a week, not because he felt he should, but because he enjoyed our conversations. We discovered shared interests that had been buried under years of him trying to become someone else and me trying to be the perfect mother to that artificial person. He started joining my book club, bringing a perspective that challenged and enriched our discussions. He took photography classes at the community center, developing an eye for capturing the subtle beauty of small-town life that he had once been eager to escape. Most surprisingly, he began writing, documenting his experience of losing and rediscovering himself in essays that were both heartbreaking and hopeful. The relationship wasn't without its complications. Daniel struggled with guilt over Emma, whom he visited monthly but could never quite connect with emotionally. Victoria remained gracious about these visits, but they were painful for everyone involved. Emma was too young to understand why her father seemed like a different person, and Daniel couldn't force feelings that simply weren't there. "I know I should love her," he confided to me after one particularly difficult visit. "She's an innocent child, and biologically she's my daughter. But when I look at her, I see evidence of choices I made that led me away from who I really was." It was a brutal honesty that spoke to larger questions about parenthood and authentic emotion. Could someone choose to love a child they felt no natural connection to? Was Emma better off with a father who was present out of duty, or would she benefit more from his honest absence? These were questions without easy answers, but Daniel approached them with the same methodical introspection he applied to every aspect of his reconstructed life. He entered therapy, not to recover his lost memories, but to understand how he had lost himself in the first place. He read extensively about identity and authenticity, trying to build a philosophical framework for the choices he was making. Meanwhile, I was facing my own challenges as our relationship evolved. After 3 years of learning to live independently, of building an identity separate from motherhood, I had to resist the temptation to make Daniel's needs my primary focus again. The boy who had returned to me was wonderful, but I couldn't afford to lose myself in caring for him the way I had before. This led to some of our most honest conversations about family dynamics and maternal devotion. Daniel recognized that part of his original transformation had been a reaction against feeling suffocated by my complete dedication to his success. He needed to know that I had my own life, my own interests, my own identity beyond being his mother. "I don't want to be your whole world again," he said one evening as we walked through the park where he had played as a child. "It's too much responsibility, and it's not fair to either of us." His words might have hurt the woman I used to be, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. Daniel was choosing to love me as I actually was rather than as the idealized mother figure he had rejected. The relationship we were building was healthier and more sustainable than what we had lost. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came news that would test the strength of our rebuilt relationship. Victoria was getting remarried to a man she had met through friends who shared her social background and understood the world she came from without needing to be transformed to fit into it. Emma would have a stepfather who could love her without reservation, and Victoria would have a husband who chose her for who she was rather than what she could offer. Daniel's reaction to this news was complicated. He felt relief that Victoria was finding happiness with someone who could give her authentic love, but also a renewed sense of guilt about Emma's future. His daughter would now have a complete family unit that didn't include him, and while he recognized this was probably for the best, it still felt like a failure of some fundamental kind. "Maybe this is how it's supposed to be," he said as we discussed the news over coffee in my kitchen. "Emma gets a real family, Victoria gets a husband who actually wants the life she offers, and I get to figure out who I am without trying to be someone else's ideal." The wedding, when it happened, was a small, intimate affair that stood in stark contrast to the elaborate production Victoria had orchestrated for her marriage to Daniel. The guest list was limited to close family and friends, people who had known the couple long enough to understand the authenticity of their connection. Daniel wasn't invited, which was appropriate but still stung slightly. I sent a card, a gesture that surprised everyone, including myself. But my feelings toward Victoria had evolved from resentment to something approaching sympathy. She had been young and naive when she fell in love with the idea of transforming Daniel, not understanding that real love doesn't require fundamental changes in the beloved. Her mistakes had been devastating, but not malicious, born from inexperience rather than cruelty. The summer Daniel turned 33, almost exactly a year after his accident, he made a decision that felt like the final step in his journey, back to himself. He bought a small house 3 blocks from mine, a modest bungalow with good bones and a yard perfect for the garden he wanted to plant. "I'm not moving back home," he clarified as we walked through the empty rooms, our voices echoing off the bare walls. "I'm choosing to stay home. There's a difference." There was indeed a difference, and it mattered enormously. Daniel wasn't retreating to familiar territory out of fear or failure. He was choosing a life that aligned with his values, in a place where he could contribute meaningfully to his community while maintaining the relationships that actually mattered to him. The house became a project that brought us together without making us dependent on each other. I helped him choose paint, colors, and advised on landscaping, but the decisions were ultimately his. He asked for my opinion but not my approval, a distinction that reflected the healthier dynamic we had developed. Daniel's first dinner party in his new home was a small gathering that perfectly captured who he had become. The guests included his favorite students and their parents, colleagues from the high school, members of our book club, and a few old friends from college who had driven over from Des Moines. The conversation ranged from local politics to literary criticism to teenage social dynamics, topics that mattered to people who cared about community and connection rather than status and wealth. I watched my son move through his own space, comfortable and confident in ways he had never been during his years in Lake Forest. He served food he had cooked himself, wine he had chosen for its taste rather than its label, and he seemed genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with external validation. "Thank you," he said to me later as we cleaned up the kitchen, together, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." "Thank you for finding your way back," I replied, though I knew the journey had been his to make. That autumn, 2 years after the accident that had changed everything, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. Emma, now 4 years old and curious about the world beyond her immediate experience, had asked to meet Daddy Daniel separately from the formal visits they had been having. Victoria brought her to Cedar Falls on a Saturday afternoon, and we all gathered in Daniel's living room with the awkwardness of people trying to navigate uncharted emotional territory. Emma was a beautiful child, intelligent and articulate, but she approached Daniel with the wariness of someone meeting a stranger who claimed a connection she couldn't understand. "Mom says you're my first daddy," Emma said with the directness children bring to complicated situations. "But I don't remember you." "I don't remember you either," Daniel replied honestly. "But maybe we could get to know each other now, without worrying about what we're supposed to remember." It was a brilliant approach that removed the pressure from both of them to perform feelings they didn't have. Instead of trying to resurrect a father-daughter relationship that had never really existed, they could start fresh and see what developed naturally. The visit was tentative but promising. Emma was curious about Daniel's house, his books, his garden. He showed her his photographs and let her help him bake cookies, activities that had no history but created new memories. By the end of the afternoon, she was calling him Daniel instead of Daddy, a distinction that felt honest and appropriate. "Would it be okay if I visited Daniel sometimes?" Emma asked her mother as they prepared to leave. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." Victoria agreed, and arrangements were made for occasional visits that would be treats rather than obligations. Emma would come to Cedar Falls when she wanted to, not according to a custody schedule, and she would leave when she was ready. The relationship, if it developed at all, would be built on genuine affection rather than legal requirements. As I watched this complicated family navigate their unconventional arrangement, I was struck by how much healthier it seemed than the artificial constructions that had previously defined their relationships. Daniel was free to be himself. Victoria was married to someone who actually chose her world. Emma had a stable family environment, and I had a son who valued our relationship enough to nurture it carefully. The path that had led us here had been painful and destructive, but the destination felt like something close to healing. 3 years after the accident, Daniel published his first book, a memoir about losing and finding identity that resonated with readers who had experienced their own versions of transformation and return. The book wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience among people who understood the difference between becoming someone else's ideal and discovering your authentic self. The publication party was held at the local bookstore, a modest affair that reflected Daniel's values and priorities. His students came, along with colleagues and friends from our community. Victoria sent a thoughtful note congratulating him on his achievement, and even Harrison Pemberton surprised everyone by ordering a copy, though he never shared his thoughts about its contents. I stood in the back of the room, watching my son read from his work to an audience that appreciated both his honesty and his courage. This was the man I had raised, finally confident enough to show himself to the world without apology or artifice. The journey had been longer and more painful than anyone could have anticipated, but it had led him home to himself. The question that had haunted me for years, whether love and sacrifice create permanent bonds between parent and child, had finally been answered. Those bonds exist, but they can be tested, strained, and even temporarily severed by the pressures of transformation and the pursuit of external validation. What matters is whether both people are willing to do the work of rediscovering and choosing each other when the artificial constructions fall away. Daniel and I had found our way back to each other not because of obligation or guilt, but because we genuinely enjoyed the people we had become. Our relationship was stronger for having been broken and rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than assumed connection. As the evening wound down and the last guests said their goodbyes, Daniel walked me to my car under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter in Cedar Falls than they had ever been in Lake Forest. "I love you, Mom," he said, and the words carried a weight they had lacked for years. "Not because I'm supposed to, but because I choose to." "I love you too," I replied, meaning it in ways I had forgotten were possible. The woman who had stood, humiliated in a marble ballroom, dismissed as embarrassing by a daughter-in-law who saw her as an obstacle to perfection, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more independent, and more worthy of love precisely because she no longer needed it to define her worth. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is the freedom to lose us completely, so they can discover whether they actually want to find us again. Daniel had made that choice, and so had I, and the relationship we had built from the ruins of what came before was more precious than anything we had lost. The road back home is never straight, but sometimes the detours teach us things we never would have learned if we had stayed on the expected path. Daniel's accident had destroyed the life he thought he wanted and revealed the life he actually needed. My years of solitude had stripped away the martyr mother I thought I was supposed to be and uncovered the independent woman I had forgotten I could be. In the end, we had both found our way back to ourselves, and in doing so, we had found our way back to each other. 5 years have passed since Daniel's book was published, and the world looks different from where I sit now in my sunroom, watching the morning light filter through the stained glass panels he installed as a housewarming gift. The colors cast rainbow patterns across the pages of the novel I'm reading, a mystery by an author I discovered during one of my solo trips to Portland last spring. At 75, I have become someone I never imagined I could be. A woman who travels alone, reads voraciously, creates art for the pure joy of it, and loves her son without needing him to complete her. Daniel's house 3 blocks away has become a gathering place for what we jokingly call our chosen family. Every other Sunday, a rotating group of friends, colleagues, and kindred spirits assembles for what started as simple dinners, but has evolved into something resembling a salon. Teachers and farmers, artists and shopkeepers, teenagers preparing for college, and retirees exploring new passions gather around Daniel's kitchen table to debate everything from local school board policies to international literature. These gatherings represent something revolutionary in both our lives: relationships built on genuine affection and shared interests rather than obligation or social expectation. The people who fill Daniel's home are there because they want to be, because they find the conversation stimulating and the company rewarding. No one performs a version of themselves designed to impress others. No one pretends to enjoy discussions that bore them or suppress opinions that might be unpopular. I watch Daniel navigate these evenings with a confidence that still amazes me. He listens more than he speaks, asks thoughtful questions, and manages to make everyone feel heard without dominating the conversation. This is the man I glimpsed in his childhood, but feared had been lost forever during his years of transformation. His authenticity draws people to him in ways his performed sophistication never could. Emma, now 9 years old, has become a regular part of these gatherings when she visits Cedar Falls. The arrangements Victoria and I worked out years ago have evolved into something none of us expected: a genuine friendship between 3 women who share the complicated love of one remarkable child. Emma spends 2 weeks each summer with Daniel and occasional weekends throughout the year, not because a court mandates it, but because she enjoys the freedom and intellectual stimulation she finds in our small town. Her relationship with Daniel has developed into something beautiful and unusual. He isn't her father in any traditional sense. But he has become something equally valuable, a trusted adult who sees her as a complete person rather than a reflection of adult hopes and fears. He challenges her thinking, encourages her curiosity, and provides a perspective on life that complements what she receives from Victoria and her stepfather without competing with it. Daniel teaches me to ask better questions, Emma told me during her last visit, articulating something profound about the gift of intellectual mentorship. Mom and Dad give me answers, but Daniel helps me figure out what I really want to know. Watching them together, I see echoes of the relationship Daniel and I have rebuilt. There is affection without possessiveness, guidance without control, love without obligation. Emma knows she is welcome in Daniel's life, but she also knows she is free to leave without guilt or recrimination. This security paradoxically makes her more likely to stay, to invest in a relationship that honors her autonomy while offering genuine connection. Victoria's second marriage has proven to be everything her first was not. A partnership between equals who share similar backgrounds, values, and visions for their future. James Whitfield understood the world Victoria came from because he was raised in it, but he also understood her need for authentic connection because he had experienced his own journey toward emotional honesty. Their wedding was intimate and joyful, focused on celebrating their genuine love rather than displaying their social status. The transformation in Victoria herself has been remarkable to witness. Away from the pressure to reshape Daniel into her family's ideal, she has relaxed into someone warmer and more genuine than I ever knew she could be. She sends me photographs of Emma's school performances and handwritten notes on holidays, gestures that feel natural rather than obligatory. We will never be close friends, but we have become something more valuable. Women who respect each other's journey and share a commitment to supporting the people we both love. The changes in my own life continue to surprise me. My art has evolved from tentative hobby to serious pursuit, with several pieces now hanging in the Regional Arts Center and a small but growing following for my photography. I travel regularly, often joining groups of women my age who have discovered the freedom that comes with grown children and financial independence. We explore museums in major cities, take photography workshops in national parks, and attend literary festivals where we can discuss books with people who share our passion for ideas. These travels have given me perspective on the provincial world I once thought was too small to contain meaningful life. Cedar Falls is indeed a small town with limited cultural offerings and narrow social possibilities, but it is also a place where neighbors know each other's stories, where contributing to community matters more than accumulating wealth, where people value character over credentials. I chose to stay not because I lack options, but because this is where I can live most authentically. The relationship between place and identity is something Daniel explores in his second book, a collection of essays about rootedness and belonging that grew out of his experiences teaching high school students who feel trapped by small-town limitations. He doesn't romanticize rural life or dismiss the legitimate desires of young people who need bigger cities to fully express themselves. Instead, he examines the complex calculus of choosing where to build a life, weighing opportunity against community, excitement against stability, growth against belonging. His students adore him, not because he tells them what they want to hear, but because he takes their dreams seriously while helping them think critically about the costs and benefits of different choices. He has become the kind of teacher I wish I had encountered at their age, someone who expands possibilities while honoring the wisdom of understanding yourself well enough to choose consciously. The high school has thrived under his influence in ways that extend beyond his individual classroom. He initiated a financial literacy program that teaches practical skills while encouraging students to examine their assumptions about success and happiness. He mentors the debate team with an emphasis on intellectual honesty rather than winning at any cost. Most importantly, he models the possibility of building a meaningful life in a place others might dismiss as a dead end. Several of his former students have returned to Cedar Falls after college, drawn by the vision of community engagement he helped them develop. They start businesses, join civic organizations, and contribute to local culture in ways that prove small towns need not be intellectual or cultural deserts. Some of them attend our Sunday dinners, bringing energy and fresh perspectives that keep our conversations dynamic. Daniel's influence on these young people reminds me of the ripple effects of authentic living. When someone chooses to be genuinely themselves, to pursue work that aligns with their values, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than social convenience, they give others permission to make similar choices. The courage to live authentically is contagious in the best possible way. This doesn't mean our lives are without struggle or disappointment. Daniel still wrestles with questions about his relationship with Emma, wondering if he is doing enough to support her. Development while respecting the boundaries that make their connection sustainable. I occasionally feel the loneliness that comes with aging, the gradual loss of friends and family members who shaped my earlier understanding of the world. But these challenges feel manageable in ways they wouldn't have during my years of desperate dependence on Daniel's approval. I have built a life rich enough to withstand loss, diverse enough to provide multiple sources of meaning and connection. If Daniel disappeared from my life tomorrow, I would grieve deeply, but I would not be destroyed. This security, ironically, makes our relationship stronger because neither of us relates to the other from a place of desperate need. The evolution of my perspective on motherhood has been one of the most profound changes of these recent years. I spent decades believing that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children's success, that maternal love requires complete selflessness, that a woman's worth could be measured by her children's achievements. The cost of these beliefs was nearly devastating. I lost myself so completely in the role of Daniel's mother that I had no independent identity to fall back on when he rejected me. Now I understand that the healthiest gift a mother can give her child is a model of what it looks like to be a complete human being. Children benefit more from seeing their parents pursue their own interests, maintain their own friendships, and take responsibility for their own happiness than from being the sole focus of parental attention. The suffocating devotion I once thought demonstrated love actually communicated the message that I had no life worth living apart from him. Daniel has told me explicitly that my transformation inspired his own journey toward authenticity. Seeing me build a meaningful life after losing him helped him understand that he could survive the loss of Victoria's approval, Emma's confusion, and his father-in-law's disappointment. My example gave him permission to choose his own values over other people's expectations because he had witnessed firsthand that such choices, while difficult, were survivable and ultimately liberating. This reciprocal influence between parent and adult child represents something beautiful about family relationships at their best. We continue to shape each other throughout our lives, not through control or manipulation, but through the power of example and the gift of unconditional acceptance. Daniel and I have given each other permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to change course when necessary, and to prioritize our own growth over maintaining comfortable illusions. The community we have built in Cedar Falls serves as an extended family for both of us, providing the kind of support network that many people search for, but few successfully create. When I was hospitalized briefly for pneumonia 2 winters ago, friends from book club took turns staying with me, bringing meals, and managing my correspondence. When Daniel's beloved dog was struck by a car, half the town seemed to appear at T, the veterinary clinic, to offer comfort and practical help. These relationships matter in ways that the superficial social connections of Daniel's Lake Forest years never could. They are based on genuine affection and mutual support rather than networking and status enhancement. People show up for each other not because it advances their social position, but because they care about each other's well-being. The investments we make in community pay dividends in belonging and security that money cannot purchase. Emma has noticed this difference during her visits, often commenting on how relaxed and connected people seem in Cedar Falls compared to the more formal social interactions she observes in her mother's circles. Everyone here seems like they actually like each other, she observed during her last summer visit, articulating something profound about the quality of relationships built on authenticity rather than advantage. This doesn't mean our community is perfect or without conflict. Small towns have their own challenges: gossip, narrow-mindedness, resistance to change, and sometimes stifling conformity. But they also offer something increasingly rare in modern life: the possibility of being known completely, of contributing meaningfully to a place where your efforts matter, of building relationships that transcend professional or social categories. Daniel and I have both learned to navigate these complexities with the wisdom that comes from understanding what we truly value. We participate in community life without sacrificing our individual integrity. We contribute to local traditions, while working to expand narrow thinking when we encounter it. We have found ways to be both rooted and free, committed and independent. The writing has become central to both our lives in ways neither of us anticipated. Daniel's third book, due out next year, explores the intersection of education and community development, examining how schools can serve as cultural centers that bind communities together while preparing young people for whatever future they choose. My own writing has been more personal. A memoir about late-life transformation that grew out of journal entries I began during my darkest period after the wedding. The process of writing about those painful years has been both difficult and healing. Revisiting the humiliation, rejection, and despair I experienced required me to sit with emotions I had worked hard to move beyond. But it also allowed me to trace the trajectory of my growth, to see patterns and meaning in what once felt like random suffering. The woman who was devastated by being called embarrassing at her son's wedding was not weak or pathetic. She was someone who had lost herself so completely in serving others that she had forgotten she existed as an independent being. Recovery required not just rebuilding my relationship with Daniel, but rediscovering my relationship with myself. This meant reclaiming interests that had been dormant for decades, developing new skills that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs, and learning to enjoy my own company in ways I had never thought possible. The loneliness that once terrified me became solitude that nourished me. My memoir will be published by a small press that specializes in stories of women's transformation. I have no illusions about bestseller lists or major publicity, but I hope the book will find its way to women who recognize something of their own experience in my story. If even one mother reads about my journey and realizes she doesn't have to disappear into her children's lives, if even one woman understands that it's never too late to discover who you are apart from your roles and relationships, then the painful process of writing about those dark years will have been worthwhile. The perspective of age has given me appreciation for the long view of human experience. The crisis that nearly destroyed me in my late 60s became the catalyst for the richest period of my life. The son I thought I had lost forever found his way back to an even deeper relationship than we had shared before. The humiliation that felt like ending became the beginning of discovering my own worth independent of other people's approval. This doesn't mean I would choose to repeat the experience or recommend it to others. The pain was real and severe, and I understand why some people never recover from similar losses. But I am grateful for what the crisis taught me about resilience, about the possibility of reinvention, about the difference between love and dependence. I learned that I was stronger than I knew, more interesting than I had imagined, and capable of building a meaningful life even after losing what I thought was its foundation. The relationships I have now, with Daniel and with the friends who have become my chosen family, are healthier and more sustainable than what I had before. They are based on mutual appreciation rather than need, on shared interests rather than obligation, on respect for each other's autonomy rather than attempts to control or possess. These relationships will survive changes, challenges, and even loss, because they are not built on the shaky foundation of emotional dependence. As I finish writing these final thoughts on a crisp autumn morning, I can see Daniel through my kitchen window, raking leaves in his yard while Emma helps by jumping in the piles he creates. Their laughter carries on the wind, a sound that speaks, of joy found rather than happiness performed. Tonight we will gather with friends for our usual Sunday dinner, sharing food and conversation that nourish both body and spirit. Tomorrow I leave for a photography workshop in Colorado, part of my ongoing education in seeing the world with fresh eyes. Daniel will drive me to the airport, not because he feels obligated, but because he enjoys our car ride conversations and wants to see me off on another adventure. When I return, I will have new stories to share and new perspectives to contribute to our community of chosen family. This is what healing looks like, not the restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something better from what remains. Daniel and I both had to lose versions of ourselves that were unsustainable before we could discover who we actually were. The mother who defined herself entirely through her son's success had to disappear before Eleanor Walsh could emerge. The young man who tried to become someone else's ideal had to lose his artificial memories before Daniel could remember who he really was. We found our way back to each other by first finding our way back to ourselves. That is perhaps the most important lesson of this long, strange journey. Love cannot survive without authenticity, and authenticity requires the courage to be alone with yourself long enough to discover who that self actually is. The sun is getting higher now, and Emma has convinced Daniel to join her in the leaf pile. Watching them play together, I am struck by the simple miracle of connection freely chosen and honestly maintained. This is what family can be when it is built on respect rather than obligation, on love rather than need, on choice rather than assumption. I close my notebook and prepare to join them in the yard, ready to embrace whatever adventures this day might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up. Just click and check them out.